Adolf Hitler is considered to be one of the most infamous and disliked individuals in history. The Nazi commander and his henchmen were responsible for millions of killings and the wholesale theft of priceless artworks when they seized power in Germany. But there was another side to him. Adolf Hitler began his career as an artist, yet he eventually climbed to power and became the dictator of Germany and the mastermind of the Holocaust. Historians of the 20th century have long debated how Hitler managed to captivate the German public's imagination and rise to power, given the destruction he left in his wake. As a person, he did not exude any kind of magnetic allure. Many referred to him as an empty vessel outside of his political life. He didn't have many true friends, and an exaggerated opinion of his own intelligence, and didn't have any inborn connections that may have helped him get to the top. The events of Hitler's childhood provide no clues about his later life. His father was a tough and authoritarian Austrian official, and Hitler's upbringing prepared him to follow in his father's footsteps and become a bureaucrat himself. The future dictator's early upbringing was reasonably normal, with the exception of the beatings he received from his father. However, throughout his teens, he grew withdrawn and friendless. He never completed his high school education and relied on his mother for livelihood from 1905 till 1907. Hitler's infamous rejection from art school in 1907 marked the beginning of a period during which he lived in Vienna, where he made grand pronouncements about art, architecture, and culture, but rarely made any serious effort to secure a future in art for himself. Hitler's failure to gain admission to art school was a turning point in his life. The dictator was a failed artist. He was advised by his professors that his talents lay more in the field of building than in painting. If we were to take a look at his paintings, we would be able to see why this is the case. His paintings never include people. Instead, they focus on landscapes and man-made structures. Hitler did not create a whole new and fascinating form of painting. Rather, he drew his inspiration from paintings that belonged to the Greco-Roman classicism, the Italian Renaissance, and the Neoclassicism movements. He kept trying to make a livelihood as an artist, painting and selling postcards in Vienna's taverns, but he was never talented enough to be an artist, which was a misfortune for millions of people over the following several decades. Realizing that his painting career had reached a dead end during World War I, Adolf Hitler fled to Munich from Austrian authorities who had learned that he had evaded the country's military service requirements. Hitler, on the other hand, would find his bearings and a foothold on which to launch his political career in the German military. Service in World War II gave Hitler a place in the world for the first time. Many of his fellow soldiers viewed him as a bit of a socially awkward oddball and prude. In the midst of Hitler's recovery from the mustard gas assault, Germany finally conceded defeat in the war while he was resting in a hospital. He went back to his regiment in Munich, and eventually he was offered a position in the information unit, where he worked in the field of military intelligence. It was this job that put him on a collision course with the German Workers' Party. Since the beginning of his career, Adolf Hitler had maintained conservative nationalist ideas, but in a critical development, the army arranged for him to hear right-wing lectures at universities on German history, socialism, and communism. In particular, Hitler ate up the words of a right-wing economist, Gottfried Feder, and a right-wing historian, Karl Alexander von Müller. Müller saw that Hitler had a knack for rhetoric and, as a result of his anecdotes, so he was recommended for a position in the intelligence unit as a spy tasked with monitoring the German Workers' Party. Hitler became a fiery speaker on the beer hall circuit and was willing to risk the humiliation of low turnout by organizing rallies in large spaces. He rose quickly through the ranks of the party's hierarchy owing to his leadership abilities. In 1920, Hitler and the other leaders of the party changed its name from the German Workers' Party to the National Socialist German Workers' Party. Hitler was elected party chairman in 1921 and immediately assumed complete leadership of the Nazi Party. The once insignificant group started gaining new members and eventually absorbed other right-wing organizations. His political career also led him to prison, where he maintained his icy demeanor. He was not a person who could keep a discussion engaging. When he was not in front of an audience, he was a somewhat uninteresting guy. Yet, something about being in front of an audience flipped a switch in him. He had the ability to milk an audience, mold it, and make it feel things. Hitler's path to power was marred by acts of violence. By 1923, he had reached the point where he felt confident enough to make an effort to violently topple the government of Bavaria, which he anticipated would ultimately lead to the toppling of the government in Berlin, the capital of Germany. Despite the fact that the beer hall putsch was unsuccessful, enormous support was maintained for Hitler's goals. His trial turned into a platform from which he could broadcast his beliefs, and the relatively short time he spent behind bars provided him with the chance to dictate the almost unreadable strategies. When he stood for president in 1932, he had a hard time connecting with people from the middle class. Despite losing the election in 1932, Hitler was able to get the backlog of a large number of significant industrial groups. After the legislative elections in Germany failed to produce a majority administration, the country's president, Paul von Hindenburg, capitulated to pressure from foreign countries and appointed Hitler as chancellor. The role of chancellor in Germany is similar to that of prime minister in other parliamentary systems, and Germany had both a president elected by the people and a chancellor representing the majority party in the government. A year later, the Reichstag building was deliberately burned down, which Hitler used as an excuse to assume emergency powers and imprison his political opponents. He was successful in getting a bill known as the Enabling Act passed by Parliament when the government began rounding up communists and other leftists. The Enabling Act gave Hitler's cabinet the authority to enact laws even without the approval of Parliament. Through his organization, oratory, and public relations, Hitler had become not only the Chancellor of Germany, but a beloved celebrity. The transformation from an artist to a dictator was complete. Yet, his admiration for art was far from gone. In fact, even in 1939, just before World War II broke out, it was reported that Hitler told the British ambassador that he did not want to end his career as a politician. Hitler said, "I am an artist and not a politician. Once the Polish question is settled, I want to end my life as an artist." Hitler and other Nazi leaders understood the power of art and architecture as a means of spreading Nazi ideology across the world. Large-scale statues depicting muscular, robust men were popular under the Third Reich because they were meant to demonstrate the supremacy of the German people and the Aryan race. In Germany, most things related to Nazism, such as swastikas, are forbidden and banned. Certain objects are allowed, such as uniforms and books, but only in accordance with stringent guidelines and under very specific conditions. This is because these artifacts have significant historical or factual significance. And what about artworks that were commissioned by the Nazis? How about artworks ordered by Hitler himself? Finally, what about Hitler's personal paintings? In Germany, it is possible to buy and sell works of art of this sort. Nevertheless, the transaction may only take place lawfully if it can be proven that the pieces were not plundered or stolen. This means that Hitler's artworks are acceptable. In spite of this, there is a well-hidden black market in Germany for Nazi art as well as for Nazi accessories. The market exists for the simple reason that one could get into trouble if it were discovered that they had an affinity for symbols that were used to justify the deaths of 17 million people. But, for instance, in the United States, these things, for some reason, are not forbidden. On August 20, 1939, Just 12 days before World War II started, the New York Times Magazine published a lengthy feature of Hitler's life at his mountain estate. The residence in Bavaria that was referred to in the article as Berghof was described as having unobtrusive elegance because it included unstained sanded wainscoting and a patternless carpet of hand-woven carpets. This wasn't a one-off. Perhaps the most astonishing thing about it is the fact that it wasn't only the New York Times that wrote about how luxurious the Nazi leaders' residences were. This was the case with a number of publications from the United States and the United Kingdom, including the Washington Post. On January 2, 1941, Preston Grover authored an article for the Post in which he described the many residences that Hitler had lived in throughout the war. With his ill-gotten gains from terrorizing the planet, the world's most monstrous dictator didn't hold back when it came to splurging on grandiose houses and outlandishly costly things. There's little evidence that Adolf Hitler was particularly interested in home design during his early years. He didn't have a home of his own until he was in his late 30s, which means growing up in a family that struggled financially was a key driving factor behind Adolf Hitler's obsession with amassing immense wealth. When he was young and without purpose in life, he would have had a difficult time discovering his vocation. His lackluster academic record and bad health would prove to be significant reasons that led to his destructive attitude on life. The incessant nagging from his family and the fact that Hitler was unable to focus poured gasoline on the fire of his already resentful nature, despite the fact that his father often urged his son to succeed in life and make something of himself. So, what caused the big change for Hitler? Hitler believed that he was a genius who was underappreciated by society. Hence, he was tremendously interested in attaining power, wealth, and societal advancement in order to reverse this perception. This obsessive pursuit led the future dictator down a road of cunning and deception because he was desperate to build a large wealth that would allow him to live a luxury lifestyle. The domestication of Hitler started in the late 1920s when the Nazi Party was attempting to broaden its appeal, especially to the middle classes, by seeming to be more mainstream in both their message and leadership. This was the time when Hitler began his shift toward domestic policy. In 1932, while the Nazi publicists were in the middle of a key election struggle, they dragged Hitler's private life into the spotlight in order to stress his moral and human nature and, as a result, win over bourgeois voters and women. In light of the facts surrounding Hitler's personal life, he was a middle-aged bachelor with few family connections and no known love relationships. This was a very bold move on Hitler's part. After he assumed power, Hitler undertook domestic architectural renovations as a means of distancing himself from his previous reputation as a rabble-rouser and drawing attention to his new role as a statesman and diplomat. In 1934, when Adolf Hitler crowned himself with the title of Führer, he took over the private residence of the previous German president and renamed it the Führerwohnung, which literally translates to leader's apartment. The infamous Nazi ruler was unhappy with the location, which he described as having an atmosphere befitting a soap manufacturer. Still, the sadistic dictator decked up the apartment with pricey works of art and antiquities, many of which had been pillaged from people who had fallen prey to his horrible dictatorship. In the late 1930s, Hitler began the process of renovating the home and enlisted Paul Ludwig Trust as his architect. After Trust passed away in 1934, his wife Gertie took up the renovations and became Hitler's personal interior designer. This photograph depicts the ominous and threatening ceremonial office that the dictator maintained inside the Reich Chancellery. Hitler's private office was more compact and austere. Aside from his official house in Berlin, he had a countryside getaway called the Berghof in Berchtesgaden. He also had a flat in Munich. During World War II, he spent more than 800 days in the fortified bunker of the Wolfschanze near Giro in what is now Poland. The Führerwohnung library housed the whole of Adolf Hitler's private book collection, which was believed to number 6,000 volumes in total. It is reported that the German dictator was a voracious reader, averaging one book per day. Despite this, the Nazi Party forbade the reading of many important works of literature, including those by Marcel Proust, Ernest Hemingway, and Aldous Huxley. During his time as Nazi Party leader, Hitler was able to maintain a comfortable political lifestyle by engaging in a number of unethical actions. The ruthless mentality of the German dictator led him to attack the riches of several businesses, companies, and even his own government in his quest to amass more fortune for himself. For that, he was renowned to be a skilled strategist. The German dictator had a strong preoccupation with wealth, and as a result, he devised a number of ingenious strategies to increase his own riches by an even greater amount. After undertaking the position of chancellor in his government, Hitler's income saw a significant hike. During the time that Hitler served as president of his nation's government, he was responsible for carrying out a wide array of corrupt schemes in order to increase his own wealth. Hitler ordered his government to buy copies of Mein Kampf as official wedding presents. The Führer made a fortune from book sales thanks to this deliberate strategy. While in office, the dictator avoided paying any kind of income tax, leading to a financial windfall that pushed his net worth into the billions. Adolf Hitler still believed that he was a guy of outstanding intelligence and held this view throughout his life. Many prominent politicians and business teachers were drawn into the Nazi regime because of the dictator's tremendous political presence, which resulted in expensive gifts and their allegiance. Hitler was renowned for using his political position to enrich himself financially at the expense of others. The dictator of Germany amassed enormous wealth, which he used to purchase a number of valuable art artifacts, elegant furniture, and even luxury residences, all of which served to highlight his unethical approach to political strategy. 3 years before Germany invaded Poland in 1939, Adolf Hitler ordered the construction of the world's largest tourist resort, located on a beachfront property on the island of Rügen. The Nazis called it Prora. Prora was designed to ease the suffering of the exhausted German worker who was forced to toil away in a factory without taking a break. It had the capacity to house more than 20,000 people at one time. According to historian and tour guide Roger Moorhouse, it was also meant to serve as the carrot to the stick of the Gestapo, a warm, pacifying gesture to get the German people on Hitler's side. But then World War II began, and Prora's construction stalled, and it is still not finished. Earnings through corrupt political agendas, book sales, and not paying income tax gave the German dictator a net worth that was unmatched. Adolf Hitler was undoubtedly one of the wealthiest political personalities of his time, and maybe in all of history. His estimated fortune was $5 billion, making him one of the richest political figures ever. As a result of his contentious tenure as head of the Nazi Party, Hitler became one of the most feared and hate-inspiring political leaders in the history of the world. His unlawful methods, which he used to make personal financial gains, wreaked havoc on the German government and were ultimately disastrous for the German people. Hitler's corrupt attitude also caused the German government to fail miserably. The massive $5 billion empire of the German dictator was the hub of unfair and illegitimate actions. It was only after Hitler's death in 1945 that the Nazi leader's enormous wealth, which included artifacts, real estate, and luxury automobiles auctioned off at astronomical prices, was finally taken care of. Following his death, The Allied Control Commission transferred all of the Nazi leaders' real estate and financial assets to the state of Bavaria. The objective of Adolf Hitler to amass a large wealth was undoubtedly accomplished, but he did so at the expense of the livelihoods of a great number of people with the assistance of criminal activity.